Over the last century, a few vehicles have revolutionized powered transportation. This Ford Model T, for instance, changed the world's byways to highways. By the same token, it took a marvel in motorized machinery to allow millions to take to the airways for the first time. A machine that Craig Singhas reacquaints us with in this special Out on a Very High Road account.
The automobile and the airplane were pretty much rival siblings when it came to capturing the popular imagination of the American public in the early part of the 20th century. But while cars such as the Model T soon put the automobile easily within the average person's grasp, air travel remained the domain of the wealthy and adventurous. No, in the 1930s, air travel was far from comfortable or reliable, and fledgling airlines were struggling to establish themselves. The 1930s were a time of great change for aviation. They were transitioning from the days of leather-helmeted barnstormers to a viable form of transcontinental transportation. And the aircraft that was responsible for this dramatic change was the DC-3. 65 years ago, the Douglas DC-3 did for commercial aviation what the Model T did for cars. Suddenly, America was on the move, and air travel became feasible for more than just adventurers.
Really, the jewel in the crown of Douglas's production was the DC-3, which American Airlines introduced in 1936, and that had 21 seats. But one of the features of the Douglas airplane that made it, as far as the passenger was concerned, superior was that it was a very clean cabin. You got into the airplane and you could walk straight down the cabin and get in every seat. The DC-3 was so obviously superior to the previous generations that within a few years every airline in the USA had them.
The DC-3 went into service with the airlines in the spring of 1936, and by 1939, 90% of all commercial passenger travel was done on DC-3s. This magnificent airframe is owned by the Delta Heritage Museum and is the actual first DC-3 to go into passenger service for Delta Airlines in 1940.
There were some retired pilots who originally came up with the idea, and this was in the early 90s. And then we acquired the plane in 93. Then it was from then till the present time, or till about a year ago, that we worked on it. We had many hundreds of people actually work on the project. We had volunteers, we had retirees. You just can't explain the dedication or understand the dedication that these people had. I don't think the intent was to ever become this emotionally attached to it. And we just did. As we found out that we were the only airline that actually had their original passenger DC-3.
And if you were a passenger on that original flight in 1940, some things would still seem very familiar.
In 1940, as well as today, flight attendants, or stewardesses back then, were primarily on board for the passenger's safety. In fact, they had to be registered nurses. There was only one galley on the original DC-3, so the flight attendant would serve for the passenger's enjoyment Coca-Cola, water, or coffee. There was only one meal service available, and that was a boxed Southern fried chicken lunch.
By 1942, the passenger manifest became quite different. DC-3s were redesignated C-47s by the Army Air Corps and R-4Ds by the Navy and Marines. They became the backbone of the Allied air transportation system. They carried supplies over Burma's hump, evacuated wounded, and dropped airborne troops by the thousands. General Eisenhower said the C-47 was one of the big reasons the Allies won the war. With over 11,000 of the military version built, many ex-military C-47s became civilian airliners. DC-3s operated with secondary and regional airlines well into the 1960s. Many people, including MotorWeek's own John Davis, took their first airplane ride on a DC-3. Not the biggest, and certainly not the fastest, but still one of the greatest. The DC-3 is the plane that gave America wings.